What if the two most fearless comedians alive decided on the same night that enough was enough? What if Dave Chappelle and Cat Williams, two men who have spent their entire career saying what nobody else will say, looked at each other and made a decision that would send shockwaves through Hollywood for years to come? Reports are now surfacing that suggest the events of that night went far deeper than anyone in the mainstream press has been willing to admit. Sources close to the situation are describing conversations that happened behind closed doors, phone calls that were made in the hours before everything exploded publicly, and a coordinated effort between two comedy legends to make sure that Will Smith would never again be able to walk into a room full of industry insiders and receive the kind of reverence he once commanded without someone in that room remembering exactly what he did and exactly what it cost everyone around him. Will Smith spent 30 years building the most carefully constructed public image in modern entertainment history. He built it brick by brick, smile by smile, blockbuster by blockbuster. And according to what is now coming to light, Chappelle and Williams didn't just chip away at that image. They walked up to it together and they burned it to the ground. Stay with us, because this story is only just beginning. There is a moment in every public figure's life where the carefully constructed version of themselves meets the real version, and one of them has to give way. For Will Smith, that moment came on March 27, 2022, in front of millions of people watching from their living rooms, and it came in the form of an open hand connecting with the face of a man who was simply doing his job. But what most people still do not fully understand is that the slap itself was not the story. The slap was the symptom. The story was everything underneath it, everything that had been building for years, everything that Hollywood had been quietly protecting, and everything that two comedians were now refusing to let disappear into the fog of celebrity news cycles and publicist-managed narratives. Dave Chappelle had been watching Will Smith for a long time, not in the way that fans watch their favorite stars, but in the way that one performer watches another when they recognize something familiar in the performance. Chappelle had spent years outside the Hollywood machine himself, had walked away from $50 million at the height of his own fame because he felt the machine was asking him to become something he was not willing to become. He understood better than almost anyone alive what it looked like when a person was performing a version of themselves rather than actually living. And for years, watching Will Smith move through Hollywood with that megawatt smile and that perfectly calibrated charm, Chappelle had seen the performance for exactly what it was. Not because Will Smith was uniquely fake, but because the machine that produced him required that level of performance from everyone it elevated to that height. Cat Williams had been saying similar things for years from a very different vantage point. Where Chappelle had been industry royalty who chose exile, Williams had spent most of his career operating in the margins, never fully embraced by the same Hollywood infrastructure that had canonized Will Smith. He had been dismissed as erratic, written off as unreliable, dragged through tabloid stories that painted him as unstable, and largely ignored by the mainstream press whenever he said something that cut too close to the truth about how the entertainment industry actually operated. But Williams kept talking. He kept naming patterns. He kept pointing at things that powerful people preferred to keep in the shadows, and he did it with a specificity and a confidence that made the people he was talking about deeply uncomfortable. When the slap happened, both men were watching, and according to sources who were present in conversations that took place in the days and weeks that followed, what they saw was not just a celebrity having a bad night. What they saw was a confirmation of everything they had been separately observing for years, suddenly playing out in real time on the biggest stage in the entertainment world. Will Smith, the most polished product the Hollywood machine had ever produced, had cracked, and the crack had not revealed something surprising underneath. It had revealed something that both Chappelle and Williams had already known was there: the rage, the unresolved pain, the desperate need to perform strength in a moment when he felt profoundly weak, and the absolute certainty, whether conscious or not, that the institution surrounding him would protect him when it was over. That certainty was not misplaced. 40 minutes after the slap, the Academy gave Will Smith a standing ovation. They handed him the highest award in film. They let him stand at the podium and speak
about love and God and destiny, while the man he had just struck was somewhere else in that building, trying to process what had happened to him. The message that sent was not subtle. It said that in Hollywood, there is a tier of celebrity that exists above consequence. It said that the right combination of box office numbers and industry relationships and carefully managed public image could insulate a person from accountability even when the entire world had just watched them commit assault on live television. It said, in short, that the machine protects its most valuable products. Chappelle understood that message immediately. He had seen versions of it his entire career. He had seen what happened to people who challenged the machine and what happened to people who served it faithfully. He had made his own very public choice years earlier when he walked away from his show. And he had paid a significant price for that choice in terms of how the industry treated him in the years that followed. But he had also gained something that Will Smith had spent 30 years carefully avoiding gaining. He had gained the freedom that comes from having nothing left to protect. When you have already burned your bridges with the machine, when you have already demonstrated that you will not be managed or controlled, when the industry has already decided you are difficult and unpredictable, there is very little left that anyone can threaten you with. Williams operated from a similar position, though he had arrived there through a different path. His outsider status had never been a choice the way Chappelle's had been. He had been pushed to the margins rather than walking there voluntarily, but the result was similar. He had nothing to lose by telling the truth. He had no carefully constructed industry relationships to protect, no upcoming projects that required the goodwill of the same people he was criticizing, no publicist calling him before interviews to remind him which topics were off limits. He was free in the way that only people who have been excluded from a system can be free, which is to say he was free from the fear of losing something he had never been fully allowed to have. The night that sources describe as the turning point came several months after the slap, when Chappelle and Williams were both at an event in Los Angeles where Will Smith's name came up in conversation among a group of industry insiders. The details of what was said in that room are still emerging, but multiple people present have described a moment where Chappelle said something that stopped the conversation cold. He reportedly said that Will Smith's problem was not that he had shown his real face for a moment. His problem was that he was already reaching for the mask again. And Williams, according to those present, agreed. He said that the machine was already working, that the same infrastructure that had protected Will Smith on Oscar night was now quietly organizing itself around his rehabilitation, deciding in advance which interviews he would give and which ones he would not, which topics would be addressed and in what carefully managed way, and which parts of the story would be allowed to fade from public consciousness. Both men had seen this process before. They had watched other celebrities move through the rehabilitation cycle, emerging on the other side with their brands intact and their accountability safely managed into oblivion. They had watched apology videos and carefully orchestrated returns and strategic philanthropic announcements, and all the other tools that the machine deploys when one of its products needs to be repaired. And they had watched audiences accept those repairs, watch the news cycle move on, watch the conversation shift, watch the moment of revelation get slowly buried under new content and new controversies, until the person at the center of it could once again walk into a room and receive the kind of welcome that suggested none of it had ever happened. They were not willing to let that happen this time, not because of any personal animosity toward Will Smith as a human being, but because of what allowing it to happen would mean for everyone who had watched that slap and internalized its lesson. Because the lesson of the standing ovation was already spreading in ways that were becoming impossible to ignore, and 5 weeks after Oscar night, that lesson would be written in the most terrifying terms imaginable, when a man with a weapon rushed the stage at a comedy show and tackled Dave Chappelle to the ground in front of thousands of people, proving that the invisible fence that had always separated performers from the audience had not just been damaged on Oscar night, it had been destroyed completely. The attack on Chappelle at the Hollywood Bowl was not a random act of violence by an isolated individual with no connection to the broader cultural moment. It was the logical extension of a message that had
been sent 40 minutes after the slap, when the most powerful institution in the entertainment world stood up and applauded a man who had just hit someone on a stage. You cannot separate those two events. You cannot look at what happened to Chappelle 5 weeks later and pretend it existed in a vacuum, disconnected from the moment when Hollywood told the world that attacking a performer in front of cameras carries no real consequence if you are famous enough and beloved enough and useful enough to the people who run the machine. Danny Zalden, who owns Stand Up New York, said it plainly. Before Oscar night, there was a fence. People simply did not cross it. After the slap, she said she had predicted immediately that it would happen again, that Will Smith had made violence against performers feel not just possible, but somehow justifiable, and that the industry's response had made it feel consequence-free. Chappelle was shaken by the attack in ways that he was careful not to show publicly, because showing it would have meant giving something to the people who had sent that message. But privately, according to people close to him, the attack clarified something that had already been forming in his mind since Oscar night. It clarified that silence was not an option, that the choice to let this moment pass, to allow the machine to do its rehabilitation work and move the conversation along, was not a neutral choice. It was a choice with consequences that extended far beyond Will Smith's career, or Chris Rock's dignity, or even the specific incident at the Oscars. It was a choice about what kind of industry comedy would operate in going forward, about whether performers could stand on a stage and do their job without calculating the physical risk of saying something that someone in the audience found offensive. 2 days after the Hollywood Bowl attack, Chappelle did something that told you everything you needed to know about who he was and how he intended to respond. He performed a secret show at the Comedy Store in Los Angeles. He did not take time off. He did not issue a statement about needing space to process. He got back on a stage in front of a live audience and he did comedy, and Chris Rock was there with him. The two men who had both been physically attacked within the same month stood together on that stage and turned everything that had happened into material, because that is what comedians do, and because doing anything else would have been a surrender that neither of them was willing to make. The moment that people who were present in that comedy store still talk about came when Chappelle turned to Rock and said that at least Rock had been slapped by someone of repute. He himself had been attacked by a man with leaves in his hair. The room exploded. But it was Rock's response that carried the real weight of the evening. He said simply and clearly that Chappelle had been attacked by the softest person that ever existed in the entertainment world. It got the biggest laugh of the night, but it was doing something much more precise than generating laughter. It was reframing the entire narrative around Will Smith in a single sentence. It was taking the image of the powerful man defending his wife's honor and replacing it with something far more deflating. Not a dangerous man, not a passionate man, a soft man, a hollow man, a man whose single moment of physical aggression had revealed not strength, but the complete absence of it. Word of what was said that night spread quickly through the industry. People who had been carefully avoiding taking a public position on the slap, who had been offering diplomatic non-answers when asked about it in interviews, who had been waiting to see which way the wind was blowing before committing to any particular response, suddenly found themselves in a different landscape. Because when Chappelle and Rock stood together on that stage and delivered those lines, they were not just making jokes, they were drawing a line. They were saying that the comedy community had a position on what had happened, that the position was not going to soften with time, and that anyone who thought this story was going to quietly fade needed to recalibrate their expectations. Cat Williams was paying close attention to all of this from his own vantage point. He had been watching the aftermath of the slap with the particular interest of someone who had spent years making observations about Hollywood that the mainstream press had consistently declined to take seriously. He had been saying for a long time that the entertainment industry operated on a set of unwritten rules that protected certain people and sacrificed others, that the elevation of any individual to the level of stardom that Will Smith had achieved required a specific kind of compliance with a system that demanded performance not just on screen, but in every aspect of a public persona. He had been specific about this. He had named patterns.
He had described mechanisms, and for years, the response from the industry and from the press had been to dismiss him as someone whose personal life made him an unreliable narrator of anything. But the slap had changed the reception of everything Williams had been saying, because here was Will Smith, the machine's most perfected product, cracking in real time on the biggest stage available, and the crack was revealing exactly the kind of thing Williams had been describing for years. The performance collapsing, the mask slipping, the real person underneath the carefully managed image suddenly visible to everyone in the most unflattering possible light. People who had previously dismissed Williams as erratic were now going back and listening to old interviews with different ears. They were finding that the things he had said, which had seemed like the ramblings of someone with an axe to grind, were starting to look like an unusually accurate map of a territory that was only now becoming visible to everyone else. Williams made a decision in the months following the slap that would ultimately prove to be one of the most consequential decisions of his career. He decided that the moment was right to say publicly and in detail everything he had been observing about Hollywood for years, and to connect it directly to what had happened on Oscar night in a way that gave people the structural context they needed to understand why that slap was not just a bad night, but a symptom of something much deeper and much more systemic. He began preparing for what would eventually become one of the most watched interviews in recent memory, a conversation on Shannon Sharpe's Club Shay Shay podcast, where he would name names, provide context, make specific and detailed accusations, and deliver all of it with the calm confidence of a man who had been waiting years for the world to be ready to hear what he had to say. The preparation for that interview, according to people familiar with the situation, involved conversations with Chappelle. The two men had known each other for years and had a relationship built on mutual respect for each other's willingness to say things that other comedians would not say. They were not coordinating their public statements in any formal sense, but they were talking, and those conversations were shaping both men's understanding of what needed to be said and how it needed to be said. Chappelle had already begun delivering his own public analysis of Will Smith in his live performances, had already offered the philosophical framework about the mask and what it meant and what it cost, had already said in front of audiences that Will Smith had spent 30 years performing a version of himself, and that Oscar night was the moment the performance broke down. Williams was preparing to take that framework and fill it with the specific, documented, named details that would transform it from a philosophical observation into something that felt much more like a reckoning. What neither man fully anticipated was the scale of the response that was coming. They knew they were saying things that people needed to hear. They knew they were addressing a cultural moment that the industry was trying to manage into silence. But the degree to which the public was ready, hungry even, for exactly this kind of unflinching analysis of what had happened and what it meant was something that would only become clear when Williams sat down with Shannon Sharpe and began to talk, and the internet caught fire in ways that no one in Will Smith's camp had been prepared for, and no publicist in Hollywood had a strategy to address. The interview dropped and the world stopped scrolling. That is not an exaggeration.
Within hours of Cat Williams sitting down with Shannon Sharpe on Club Shay Shay, the clip count was climbing in ways that the platform had rarely seen for a non-music, non-sports piece of content. People were not just watching it, they were sending it to their friends with messages that said things like, "You need to see this right now," and "I cannot believe he actually said that out loud." The reason was not just what Williams was saying, though what he was saying was extraordinary in its specificity and its fearlessness. The reason was how he was saying it. He was calm. He was precise. He was not performing outrage or playing to the camera or reaching for dramatic effect. He was simply telling the truth as he understood it, with the unhurried confidence of a man who had been waiting for this moment for a very long time and was in absolutely no rush now that it had finally arrived. He talked about Hollywood as a system, not as a collection of individuals making individual choices, but as a machine with its own logic, its own incentive structure, its own methods of rewarding compliance and punishing resistance. He described the process by which a person gets elevated to the level of stardom that Will Smith had achieved, and he was
unflinching about what that process requires. It requires the creation of a persona that is more palatable and more profitable than the actual human being. It requires the suppression of anything that does not serve the brand. It requires a level of performance that extends far beyond the screen and into every public appearance, every interview, every red carpet moment, every carefully staged candid photograph. It requires, in short, that you agree to stop being yourself in exchange for the kind of fame and wealth and institutional support that most people can only dream about. Williams had watched Will Smith make that agreement and execute it with a skill that he genuinely acknowledged was remarkable. He was not dismissive of the craft involved in what Smith had built. He understood that maintaining that level of performance for 30 years required real discipline and real intelligence. But he was also clear about what the agreement cost. It cost Will Smith the ability to process his own pain in private, because everything in his life had become public property, managed for maximum brand value. It cost him the ability to have a genuine relationship with his own emotions, because genuine emotions are unpredictable, and unpredictability is the enemy of brand management. It cost him, ultimately, the ability to respond to the accumulated weight of everything he had been carrying: the public humiliation of the Entanglement confession, the years of online mockery, the slow erosion of the invincible box office draw status he had once possessed, in any way other than the way he finally did respond, which was explosively, publicly, and in the worst possible setting imaginable. Williams connected this directly to the slap in a way that went beyond anything Chappelle had said in his performances. Where Chappelle had offered the philosophical framework, the mask and what it concealed, Williams provided the structural explanation for why the mask had been built in the first place and who had benefited from its construction. He named the people and the systems that had invested in keeping Will Smith's real self hidden beneath the performance, and he named them not with the vague gesturing of someone making insinuations, but with the specific confidence of someone who had been inside enough rooms to know exactly how the machinery operated. The reaction from Hollywood was immediate, and it was telling, not public. Nothing in Hollywood happens publicly when the industry feels threatened. It was the quiet kind of reaction, the kind that happens in phone calls and text messages and conversations at industry events, where people speak in careful language that says everything without technically saying anything. Sources who were present in various settings in the days following the Williams interview described an atmosphere of genuine alarm among certain powerful figures in the entertainment world. Not alarm at what Williams had said about Will Smith specifically, but alarm at the broader implication of what he had done, which was to describe the machinery itself in terms that anyone watching could understand, to make the invisible visible in a way that the industry had spent decades and enormous resources keeping invisible. Will Smith's team was in crisis mode. This was not the first time they had been in crisis mode since the slap, but it was the first time the crisis felt genuinely unmanageable. The apology video that Smith had released on YouTube in July of 2022, the one that Chris Rock had publicly dismissed as a hostage video, had been a calculated attempt to control the narrative, to get ahead of the story, to demonstrate a version of accountability that was managed enough to serve the rehabilitation process, without requiring any genuine engagement with the substance of what had happened. It had not worked particularly well even at the time of its release. Rock's dismissal of it had ensured that, but it had at least represented a coherent strategy. What Williams had done in his interview was not something that a YouTube apology video had any hope of addressing, because Williams had not just described what Smith had done, he had described why Smith had done it, and who had helped create the conditions that made it inevitable, and that was a much larger and much more complicated thing to respond to. Chappelle watched the response to the Williams interview with a satisfaction that he later described in performances as feeling like watching a window get opened in a room that had been sealed shut for years. He had been saying versions of what Williams said for months in his live shows, but the reception had been filtered through the particular lens that audiences bring to stand-up comedy, which tends to soften the edges of even the sharpest observations by framing them as performance rather than testimony. Williams had delivered the same material as testimony, sitting in a chair, speaking directly to camera without the
protective framing of a comedy set, and the effect was completely different. It felt like a deposition. It felt like evidence. It felt like the kind of thing that does not go away, because it has been said in a context that does not allow for the comfortable dismissal that comedy sometimes enables. The two men spoke again after the Williams interview aired. According to people familiar with the conversation, Chappelle told Williams that he had done something that could not be undone, and that he meant that as the highest possible compliment. Williams reportedly responded that undoing it was never the point. The point was to make sure that the people who needed to hear it could no longer pretend they had not. Because that was the thing about Will Smith's situation that both men found most important to address. It was not just that he had done something wrong. It was that the system surrounding him was organized around ensuring that the wrongness could be processed and managed and eventually forgotten, and that the forgetting served the system's interests, even if it served no one else's. Chris Rock had been watching all of this from a position that was different from both Chappelle and Williams. He was the person who had actually been hit. He was the person whose face had been the surface on which Will Smith had chosen to perform his moment of displaced rage. And he had been largely silent in public since the night it happened, not because he had nothing to say, but because he was a comedian, and he understood that the right way to say it was on a stage, in a set, in front of an audience, in the context where he had always been most himself and most powerful. He was working, he was preparing, and what he was preparing was going to be the most precisely crafted and most personally devastating response to the slap that anyone had yet delivered. A response that would take everything Chappelle had said philosophically and everything Williams had said structurally, and ground it in the specific, physical, personal reality of what it had actually felt like to be the man standing at that microphone when Will Smith's hand connected with his face. The world would not have to wait much longer to hear it. Chris Rock was almost ready, and when he finally stepped onto that stage in Baltimore and the Netflix cameras began rolling, everything that had been building since Oscar night, every philosophical observation and structural critique and comedy club whisper and industry alarm bell, was about to find its most direct and its most human and its most unforgettable expression in the voice of the one person in this entire story who had earned the right to say exactly what he thought without anyone in the world being able to tell him he had gone too far. The lights came up at Baltimore's Hippodrome Theater on March 4, 2023, and Chris Rock walked onto that stage, to an audience that had been waiting nearly a year to find out what he was going to say. The energy in the room was unlike anything that a typical comedy show generates, because this was not a typical comedy show. Everyone in that building, and the millions who would watch it stream on Netflix in the hours and days that followed, understood that what they were about to witness was something more than a stand-up set. It was a reckoning. It was the moment when the person at the center of the most talked-about incident in recent entertainment history was finally going to speak on his own terms, in his own language, on his own stage, without a publicist in his ear or a carefully prepared statement in his hand, or any of the other machinery of celebrity crisis management anywhere near him. He spent the first 50 minutes not going there. He talked about other things. He covered woke culture with the kind of surgical precision that had always been his trademark. He talked about the Kardashians. He talked about Meghan Markle. He talked about alopecia itself, the condition that Jada Pinkett Smith had publicly discussed and that had been at the center of the joke that preceded the slap, and he talked about it in a way that was both funny and pointed, and that made very clear he had spent a lot of time thinking about every single dimension of what had happened that night. The audience laughed and applauded and waited, because everyone in that room could feel what was coming, could sense it building underneath the surface of everything he was saying, like pressure accumulating behind a wall that everyone knew was eventually going to give way. And then with 10 minutes left, it gave way. He said the slap still hurt. He said he still had "Summertime" ringing in his ears, a reference to Will Smith's biggest rap hit that transformed Smith's most famous artistic achievement into a punchline about ongoing physical pain, and it was the kind of joke that only works if the person making it has genuinely earned the right to make it, which Rock had earned in the most direct and undeniable way
possible. The audience's laughter carried something in it that was different from the laughter earlier in the set. It carried recognition and relief and a kind of collective exhale, the sound of people finally hearing someone say the thing that everyone had been thinking for a year. He established the physical reality of the situation with a calm and a clarity that was more devastating than any amount of outrage could have been. He noted that Will Smith was significantly larger than him, that Will Smith had played Muhammad Ali in a major motion picture and had trained for that role with the kind of physical preparation that professional athletes undertake, that Chris Rock had played a character named Pookie in a film and a piece of corn in a children's movie. He was not performing victimhood. He was not asking for sympathy. He was simply laying out the facts of what had actually happened in physical terms. And the facts were that this had not been a confrontation between equals, and everyone watching had known that from the moment it occurred. It had been a large, physically powerful man hitting a smaller man who was holding a microphone, and who everyone in that theater, including Will Smith, knew was not going to hit back. Then he said what he had come to say. He had nothing to do with the situation between Will and Jada. He had no entanglements. The word landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples out in every direction simultaneously. Because everyone watching understood exactly what that word meant, and exactly why he was using it. Jada Pinkett Smith had used that word herself, in public, on her own platform, to describe her relationship with singer August Alsina, a relationship that she had chosen to discuss publicly in a way that had exposed her husband to a level of public humiliation that went far beyond anything a joke about a haircut could have ever approached. Rock laid out the timeline with a precision that felt almost clinical in its effectiveness. He pointed out that everybody in the world had been calling Will Smith names and calling Jada a predator in the aftermath of that Red Table Talk episode. He pointed out that the people who had actually caused Will Smith pain, who had actually humiliated him publicly, who had actually damaged his marriage and his reputation and his sense of himself as a man, were not standing on a stage at the Oscars holding a microphone. And then he asked the question that he already knew the answer to, and that everyone watching already knew the answer to. Who did Will Smith choose to hit? Not the people who had called him names online, not August Alsina, not anyone who had actually been involved in or commented on the situation that had genuinely wounded him. He hit Chris Rock, a smaller man, a man he had known professionally for years, a man who was standing at a microphone doing a job, a man who he was absolutely certain would not hit back. Rock called it weak behavior, and he was right, but he was doing something more sophisticated than simply calling Will Smith weak. He was describing the specific psychology of what had happened in a way that stripped away every romantic interpretation of the slap that had been offered in the years since it occurred. He was dismantling the narrative that had been quietly circulating in certain corners of the internet, and even in certain celebrity circles, the narrative that painted Will Smith as a man driven to the edge by love for his wife, a passionate defender of the woman he loved who had simply reached his breaking point. Rock was saying clearly and without any ambiguity that that narrative was false, that what Will Smith had done was not passion, it was not love, it was not protection. It was the act of a man who needed to perform strength he did not feel, who needed to manufacture a moment of dominance to compensate for a long period of public emasculation, and who chose the safest possible target at the highest possible profile moment to do it. The portrait Rock drew that night was the most complete and the most human and the most painful portrait of Will Smith that anyone had yet offered, more complete even than Chappelle's philosophical framework, and more personal than Williams' structural critique, because Rock was the only one of the three who had actually been in that moment, who had felt the physical reality of it, who had stood there in the seconds after it happened trying to process whether what had just occurred was real. And what he was saying was that the man who had done it was not a villain in the traditional sense. He was something more complicated and in some ways more sad. He was a person who had spent so long performing a version of himself that he had lost the ability to process his own pain in any way that did not involve performance. And when the pain had finally become too much to contain, the performance he had chosen was the worst one available to him. The special was the
most watched comedy event of the year. The numbers were not close. People who had not watched a stand-up comedy special in years sat down and watched Selective Outrage from beginning to end, and then sent it to everyone they knew. And in the days that followed, something happened that no one in Will Smith's camp had been fully prepared for, which was that the conversation did not move on. Normally, at this point in a celebrity rehabilitation cycle, the public attention begins to diffuse. New controversies emerge. New content floods the feed. The algorithm moves people along to the next thing, and the thing before it begins to recede. But the combination of what Rock had said and what Williams had said, and what Chappelle had been saying for months in his live performances, had created something that was resistant to the normal mechanisms of forgetting. It had created a complete and coherent narrative, one with a philosophical dimension from Chappelle, a structural dimension from Williams, and a personal and human dimension from Rock. And complete, coherent narratives do not dissolve the way isolated incidents do. Will Smith went quiet. His team released careful statements. Sources close to him told reporters that he had not watched Rock's special directly, but had been told what was said, that he was hurt, that he felt Rock had gone too far by bringing Jada into it again, that he wanted everyone to move on. The irony of Will Smith wanting Chris Rock to move on from being hit by Will Smith was not lost on anyone paying attention. And the YouTube apology video that he had released the previous year, the one Rock had dismissed as a hostage video, began to circulate again in the new context created by the special, and it looked even more like what Rock had called it the second time around than it had the first time. The Academy's 10-year ban was still in effect. Projects that had been associated with his name had quietly moved in other directions. Emancipation, the slavery drama that was supposed to demonstrate his range and his seriousness as an actor, had been released into a world where audiences, as Rock noted in his special, found themselves unable to engage with it the way its filmmakers had intended.
The film he had made to show the world who he really was had become, through no fault of its content, a vessel for a different kind of truth than anyone had planned. His theatrical box office presence had not recovered. The invincible Will Smith, who could open a film on his name alone, who had been quietly fading even before Oscar night, had not returned. What Chappelle and Williams and Rock had done together, without ever formally coordinating, without ever sitting in the same room and deciding on a strategy, was something that the Hollywood machine had no established protocol for addressing. They had told the truth. They had told it from 3 different angles with 3 different kinds of authority and 3 different kinds of evidence. They had told it in the specific language and the specific context, comedy, where truth has always been able to go places that journalism and formal criticism cannot reach. And they had told it with enough consistency and enough detail and enough personal credibility that the normal tools available to a celebrity in crisis, the managed apology, the strategic reemergence, the carefully timed philanthropic gesture, the new project designed to remind people of everything they used to love, had found no purchase. The mask was off. Chappelle had said that first, and he had said it with the kind of philosophical weight that made it feel permanent. And permanence was exactly what it had turned out to be. Not because any single thing any of these 3 men had said was individually enough to end a career, but because together they had done something much more durable than ending a career. They had changed the lens. They had made it impossible to look at Will Smith without seeing through the image to the machinery behind it, without understanding the slap not as an aberration, but as a revelation, without recognizing that the 30 years of carefully managed perfection had not been a reflection of who Will Smith was, but a construction designed to conceal it. And once you see a construction for what it is, once the mechanism behind the illusion has been explained to you in terms you cannot unhear, the illusion does not come back. That is what 3 comedians did in the span of about 18 months. They did not end Will Smith's career with a single night. They ended the version of Will Smith that had made the career possible in the first place, and that in the end turned out to be the same thing. So here we are. 3 comedians, 3 different angles, 1 complete and devastating truth that Hollywood spent 30 years and enormous amounts of money making sure you would never fully see. Dave Chappelle gave you the philosophy. He told you that the mask exists, that it always existed,
And that the moment it came off was not the beginning of something new, but the end of something that was never real to begin with. Cat Williams gave you the structure. He showed you the machinery behind the mask, the deals and the systems and the people who profit from keeping the real person hidden beneath the performance. And Chris Rock gave you the humanity. He stood on a stage in Baltimore and told you in the plainest possible terms what it actually felt like to be the person that Will Smith chose as the surface for his performance of strength. And he did it without self-pity and without exaggeration, and with a precision that made it impossible to look away. Will Smith still has money. He still has a house and a fan base and the memories of a career that genuinely meant something to a generation of people who grew up watching The Fresh Prince and cheering in movie theaters when he saved the world. None of that disappears, but something else is gone, and it is not coming back. The version of Will Smith that could walk into a room and fill it with warmth, without anyone in that room thinking about what they now know, that version has been replaced permanently by a more complicated and more honest version. And the replacement was not done by his enemies, or by the press, or by cancel culture, or by any of the other forces that celebrities typically blame when their images fracture. It was done by the truth, delivered by 3 men who had nothing left to lose and everything important to say. Now we want to hear from you, because this conversation is not finished, and your perspective is part of it. Do you think there is a version of this story where Will Smith genuinely rebuilds? Not just professionally, but in the way that audiences actually feel about him when they see his face? Is there a path back to something real, or has too much been revealed for that kind of return to ever feel authentic? And what about the comedy world? Do you think the invisible fence that Will Smith knocked down on Oscar night has been rebuilt by what Rock and Chappelle and Williams did? Or is it still broken in ways that performers are living with every single time they step onto a stage? Drop everything you are thinking in the comments right now. Like this video if it made you see something differently. Subscribe because we are just getting started, and the stories we are coming for next make this one look like a warm-up. We will see you there.